Speaker, what happened in the early hours of last Wednesday morning was one of the most unimaginable tragedies our country has seen in many years.
Get out! Get out! Fire!
It was just escalating horror as we saw what had happened. I actually cycled pretty close to Grenfell. And the first time I actually physically saw the building, I had to stop and just look. It was just shocking.
Dropping my daughter off at school and turned on the news when I got back from school and just saw these dreadful, dreadful pictures of what was going on in a community incredibly close to where we are now. And then after the initial sort of horrors of the loss of life, there was the news reports into the safety of the cladding system.
My offices in London are, as the crow flies, a short distance from Grenfell, and I could see the smoke still rising. It struck me as being rather strange that life went on as normal. You know, the phones were ringing, or in this day and age, the emails continued to come through.
Just the shock of it, and then when you started to hear about the numbers of people that died and the kind of, that kind of horrible sense of what it must have been like to be in the tower at the time.
It was like looking at 9/11 all over again. It was a big shock when I found out what had happened and why it had happened, and the repercussions within our industry were, you could tell were going to be massive.
As an architect, it's kind of has a kind of particular resonance when it's a building disaster. I kind of felt quite angry as well as more and more details emerged. Angry at the kind of wider social structures that allowed it to happen.
This area is massively affected by the cladding scandal because it's an area of quite intense redevelopment. We've been here for 8 years now. My daughter is now 9. She goes to school locally. It's a lovely community. All the kids go to the same school, so I overlook a park. It's a really, really lovely place to live. But unfortunately, we've all had quite a cloud over our heads in the form of the cladding scandal. One of my neighbours contacted me and said, we have been trying to sell our flat and we've been told by our buyer they've had to pull out because they can't get a mortgage because the lender needs this EWS1 form. I thought, what's an EWS1 form? And they said, it was released by the Institute of Chartered Surveyors for buildings like ours, and these buildings need this form in order for it to be classified as safe and therefore saleable. We're living in tinder boxes. We don't know how safe we are. For those of us who are leaseholders, we would potentially be responsible for the cost of the remediation work that might be required.
That
And Horton Moth's from Miraculous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And who's that?
Miss Bustier, the Miraculous teacher.
My daughter said to me, Mummy, do you think I could take some of my cuddly toys and put them in the car just in case there's a fire? And you just think, why should children have to think about that? You can't dress it up, you can't sugarcoat it. You have to say, well, when these flats were built, they were meant to be built so they were safe, so if there was a fire, you could stay in your home and the fire brigade would help and stop the fire. But now we found out that parts of it aren't safe, so if there is a fire, we have to get out, and unfortunately it might spread. You can't, how do you make that sound child-friendly? You can't. So my daughter is aware of it. Her friends who live in this block, they're also aware of it. All of them, all of the kids are. They see these waking watch guys. I mean, the word waking watch is quite a sort of scary word. These men on the stairs, at night, going up and down in high-vis jackets. It is terrifying. We bought these homes in good faith. It's criminal. But what's really sad is it's putting people off the community, and people who've moved in are desperate to move out. So it's putting a sledgehammer through quite a strong community.
The morning after Grenfell, maybe a couple of days later, I did a tweet that said, "We don't know the exact causes of the tragedy at Grenfell, but I think those in construction will recognise the culture that delivered it. There's actually an interesting point about how construction deals with requests for information. The view is that if somebody asks you for some information, the first thing you ask yourself is, how will they use that against me? So I have to be very careful about information I pass to make sure that I don't incriminate myself for something else. And that kind of comes down to the contractual basis on which we operate, which is not entirely collaborative.
We did a call centre in Belfast, which had 5,000 people in it, so it was very important that they wanted that cladding off straight away and new cladding put on. What we're finding when we have stripped these buildings is that, unfortunately, the quality checks that weren't done on most of them, we're finding horrendous problems with no air tightness, no cavity barriers. If there is cavity barriers, they haven't been fixed correctly because no one was trained back in the day to fix cavity barriers. It was just a piece of rock wall with a pin through it. We did an apartment block in Leeds. We finished it a year ago, and we were taking the cladding off, and you could literally see into the building, into someone's apartment, because there was no seals, there was no airtight lines, there was nothing. The heat loss through that building must have been unbelievable.
We all knew in construction that there wasn't an adherence to regulation. There was virtually zero enforcement in place, and therefore we knew something would happen, but nobody understood the scale of the tragedy that occurred. We spend quite a lot of time doing design, generally for building the client can't afford. And then we end up in a value engineering exercise to get to the point at which there is we meet the budget. And then we start to construct as quickly as possible to start to trigger funds on the project. And it could be, only 20% of the building is actually designed and we're away building. That leads to a kind of hurry-scurry method of construction where you put stuff in, then you get it wrong and you have to take it out. So that allows people then to put in something for planning and then deliver something completely different.
Grenfell's the tip of the iceberg in terms of it's being interrogated, it's being looked at in great detail and what happened. But somehow that what happened there has been replicated, hundreds of times and is continuing to cause a huge amount of pain and financial distress for people in those kind of in those buildings.
Early in the days of Vivalda in London, there was a fire involving cladding at Lakanal House in southeast London, and needless to say, we took a lot of notice of what the causes were. And yet, looking back, for some reason, there wasn't the urgency to do something about it by the authorities, even though people had lost their lives in some number. And eventually, to the shame of the authorities, the lessons to be learned from Lakanal House were not put into practice. In fact, I don't think the lessons from Lakanal House were widely distributed to those who should know. And it became a question of business as usual. Clearly, sometime between the events of Lakanal House and Grenfell, Grenfell was refurbished with the dangerous material. So nobody seemed to take a lot of notice of what had happened at Lakanal House then. So if only we'd had a thorough public examination of the causes of Lakanal House and what could be done to prevent it happening again, then perhaps Grenfell might not have happened and the loss of life which ensued. Grenfell cladding was a product called ACM, which stands for Aluminium Composite Material. Basically, it's a sandwich of two thin skins of aluminium with a core of, in this case, I think a polyurethane, which in the case of Grenfell, tragically, was flammable, highly flammable. I remember being introduced to ACM in the 1980s, and it was put forward to me to fill a gap in the range of the company I worked for at the time, to supply to shop fitters. It made good signage. Perhaps looking back, it didn't occur to me just how widespread the use of ACM had become in this country. It certainly should not have been used for cladding a high-rise.
As an industry, we assemble products to look like the design, and actually a building should be a product, an holistic, integrated system. And unless it is, you end up with assembled products that look like the design, but actually function very poorly because the bits don't fit together.
I think one of the negative things in the industry was, you know, if you were the cheapest, sometimes you were the best, and that didn't always end up to be the truth. So I think a lot of main contractors did get stung by poor quality choice of subcontractors. Unfortunately, price was king with materials. Certain insulations were used within the cavity that were combustible. Timber used within the cavities that obviously combustible. There was no compartmentation.
Where my concerns lie is that people get hold of this material where it isn't their day job and they think they know one or two things about it, and make claims for it which they either knowingly or unknowingly make for its performance. So we need to make sure that the market is aware that there are good people and people who don't know an awful lot out there, and they need to be careful. And what we at Vivalda do is fly the flag for safety. It didn't take the Grenfell tragedy for us to become aware of the need for safety. We rarely get to see a complete system, so that you could have cladding manufacturer A with a fully tested product and cladding component manufacturer B with also a fully tested component, with the idea that it marries up to the specification of the cladding product. But putting two and two together like that does not necessarily make four, because it hasn't been tested together.
There is anger, and there is also great solidarity.
Was cladding of the type used in Grenfell Tower compliant?
We rely so much on advice from suppliers and manufacturers, as well as the testers and the certifiers. And the inquiry so far has shown that maybe we can't rely on that information. Grenfell has to be a watershed for a kind of complete culture change within the industry. I was kind of following, you know, the testimony and the events at the inquiry, and was kind of shocked, you know, really taken aback by some of the things that I'd heard, kind of angry about it, because clearly people had been deliberately misled. The actions of some of the companies involved in the project were something that went against our own values. And as a result, we can take a stand and say we're not going to specify products produced by those companies. It's subsequently led to conversations and other colleagues and other architects emailing us or contacting us to say that they're going to do the same thing.
Today, the whole country, the whole world, is finally hearing the truth about what happened at Grenfell Tower on the 14th of June 2017.
We're in that position now where the systems out there, manufacturers have got tested systems which are A1 rated, non-combustible and ready to go. I believe there's 2,000 buildings out there that are desperately in need of refurbishing, the cladding taken off and replaced with something that's non-combustible. And what's frustrating from my point of view is that we've been asked to get involved with a lot of buildings within the last 2 years, which are still stood there now in exactly the same state. And there's got to come a point in time, and I hope it's not another fire, that stirs the government or the developers or the building owners into making sure that doesn't happen again. As a consequence of Grenfell, what's happened is that the manufacturers now have to have an approved and tested system. So we can't buy a panel from one manufacturer, a support system from another, insulation from another, and put them all together without it being tested and it's proven to be non-compostable and an A1 rating. So what we're doing with our installers is that once we've got a system that's picked for a building, is that we're making sure that they go on a training course with the manufacturer which involves all the elements of the structure, so that they know what they're fixing is to the right specification.
As I have said repeatedly, without this bill, the legal ambiguity around the fire safety order will continue.
The regulator will make sure that those buildings in the future are constructed in the proper way. And to help the regulator do that, there's also going to be a new document which every building will have, called a golden thread, indicating exactly what products have been used in exactly what way in that particular construction, so that there's complete transparency, and anyone concerned can look into how the building they occupy is constructed.
The golden thread, I think, is essential. The number of times you go on a project and you cannot find any information on how is the building put together. How did they come to decisions? How did you decide that this was a good solution to a problem? It isn't unusual for contractors to go on site and tell clients about systems they never knew they had.
To have this kind of thread of knowledge and responsibility running through the project has to be a good thing. What that looks like, we don't know yet. And I guess it's upon all of the different players within a project and within the industry to kind of work out where they sit within that new structure and that new levels of responsibility.
Someone has to take ultimate responsibility for the design and the installation, and it was very fragmented. We're in an industry where there isn't a lot of longevity, so someone could do a fantastic high-rise building and 2 years later they're no longer there and there's no one to take that responsibility. So it's even more important now that main contractors, everybody, ensures that whoever's doing that building is going to be there throughout its life virtually, so that there is accountability for what's being built.
There is confusion about roles and responsibilities throughout, and a general lack of competence and accreditation in many areas. I can confirm that there is a systemic failure here, which needs to be addressed by a significant culture change, and which will need to involve a wide range of people who are part of the system.
Dame Judith Hackett said that clients should understand their responsibility and feel their responsibility, and I think that's important because that drives behaviours right the way through the supply chain. And I think if you get those elements together, then we will start to see an industry that understands the requirement to be competent and compliant and can evidence that competence and compliance.
I think the building industry had a bad name. Grenfell has made the name even worse. And so what we're doing now has got to be good for the industry as a whole, and hopefully it'll bring more people, young people, into the industry.
If you start to deliver buildings that you deliver on time, on budget, reliably, and you don't disrupt people's lives significantly, then you can start to improve the image of the industry. And then people will start to say, actually, that's a good career for me to be in. I like to do that. So we always kind of say, well, we need to improve the image. Actually, improve the industry, the image will sort itself out. The vast majority of the industry, I think, once they finally clock onto the fact big change is coming, will embrace that change, because good companies have nothing to fear from better enforcement of design requirements and better enforcement of planning and safety regulation.
What we do here in Scotland with our aluminium is we process a thick grade of solid aluminium, usually 3mm thick, and that provides an A-class fire solution. There is nothing within the aluminium given that it's the stuff we make aeroplanes out of, that will combust. There is nothing that will catch fire.
The panels that are on the line just now are solid aluminium that has been powder coated and is now going to be taken to our site in Slough. Slough is a site with 2 residential multi-storey tower blocks, and it's a fire-safe reclad job that we're working on. We've been doing that since last December, and we're hoping to be finished the project by the end of this month.
We can offer this safe material, which is being used the length and breadth of the country, most of which is replacing materials which have been deemed to be unsuitable in the first place. I've heard it said that the type of insulation used on Grenfell was a grimly perfect way of stacking petrol vertically. And the question I'm asking, to which I've not had an answer yet, is what happens when the outside of a building is clad in perfectly adequate material, where there's no dispute, but underneath it is this very dangerous foam insulation. We don't want things covered up, no pun intended, as far as the insulation is concerned, because I would imagine that if faulty insulation of the type which went up so disastrously on Grenfell is widely used throughout the country, and it is, then it's high time that too was looked at. And perhaps some of these multinational companies with deep pockets ought to start looking at themselves, and if they don't, pressure should be put on them for them to fund the replacement. Grenfell was a galvanising experience for all the wrong reasons, but we have to do better. My chosen life, as it were, is now tinged with tragedy. And how do you get out of that? Well, I came to the conclusion that the way you get out of it is by making sure that it doesn't happen again. You know, we can all shut up shop and head for the hills, but would that save the next Grenfell? And whose expertise are they going to rely upon if we weren't around?